So where have I been these last 4 months or so? Well, I finished my last video at the beginning of what started off as a mild case of insomnia caused by a burning sensation on my skin at night, which quickly led to a more intense burning that was basically all over my body. It felt like I was laying in the sun at 12 noon, though it was midnight and I was under the covers. And the burning would just move all over my skin. As the weeks progressed, it became chronic, and I had to take a leave of absence from work after I had been awake 4 full days in a row. My worst month of sleep probably left me awake for about half the month, but the most at one time was 4 days. This put a whole new perspective for me about being refined in the fire. You're probably wondering what my doctors were saying. Well, at first, they thought it was because I had lost too much weight too quickly. I lost 30 pounds in a few months. Then they thought it had something to do with discs in my spine that had degenerated. A friend of mine thought that it could be Lyme disease, which my doctor thought was interesting. A dermatologist thought it was shingles, and then they thought that it was related to stress. So I went to see a psychologist. The first psychologist that I seen said that it was not related to stress. Adding to my frustration was trying to get answers in the middle of a pandemic. It was hard to say the least. But I quickly had some blood tests to rule out some catastrophic diseases and cancers. X-rays on my spine, and I was given appointments eventually for a sleep clinic, nerve conductivity testing, and a psychiatry referral. It was extremely frustrating, to say the least. Said in the language of parable used in the New Testament, everyone was blind to what was happening. Blind faith is a tremendous amount of fun, as you can imagine. And said in the plain language of the Old Testament, everyone was in a lack of knowledge and trying to figure out what was wrong. All we knew was that I had some kind of neuropathy that was affecting my skin, but I knew that Satan's leash had been loosened and he was now allowed to attack me. My wife and friends, well, they had begun to notice a considerable mental decline. And as you can imagine, it did not seem like there was going to be any answers that were going to lead to any successful outcome anytime soon. There were a lot of theories on their part about what was going on and some heavy criticisms about the main doctor treating me. I was placed on some pretty powerful medications that included sleep medication and left to wait. Even with sleep medication, sleep was frustrating. As you can probably imagine, I am examining my life to see if there is any sin in it. But at least at this time, I cannot find any, though I do sin from time to time. I and everyone around me were completely dumbstruck about what was going on. And the whole time I'm praying to Jesus for answers, but nothing. I eventually sought a second opinion from a different psychologist as I began to notice that in mildly stressful situations, my skin would burn consistently. Eventually, after many appeals to Jesus for relief from the suffering I was going through, I believe he said to me right in my mind, "Trust me." Sounds like wait. But was it just me talking to myself? Anyhow, trust me was not what I wanted to hear when I could barely think, but to some degree it was calming, as long as it was Christ. So I pressed on with this new psychologist. It took a while to get in to see this guy, and the second opinion led to a diagnosis of complex PTSD. People with PTSD can have an overactive stress response system which raises cortisol levels, a stress hormone, past the point where they can fall asleep naturally. What is complex PTSD as opposed to simple PTSD, you ask? Well, whereas simple PTSD has one event that triggers symptoms, an example being two soldiers crawling through a minefield in Vietnam, One crawls over a mine and blows up. The other soldier sees his friend blown to pieces, but crawls through successfully and survives. However, that image of his brother's death, one event, can trigger symptoms of PTSD. A person with complex PTSD has many events, not just one. You might be wondering what gave me this illness. Well, it was the extremely abusive way I was raised by my mother and father. Abuse that I could not run away from. I could not escape. No fight or flight. So I had to constantly scan my environment for threats as a child. This stress response would release that hormone called cortisol, which is released from the top of your two kidneys. Though I have not done a video on what triggered all this later on in life, and I probably won't, I had been in faith in a very stressful situation for about a little over a year. I helped a lot of people during this time. But the constant stress from what was happening to the people I cared about, and me personally, led to my body secreting this hormone non-stop. Because, like when I was a child, I had to constantly scan for threats in my environment. But by the grace of God, I found an expert in this area and then begun the healing process. Having said all that, this eventual breakdown of my body, by me standing in faith for so many people, reminded me of this verse of Scripture. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. My mind tells me all the risky and challenging things that I can do for Christ by faith, but my body can only handle so much. The prescription from the psychologist was diaphragmatic breathing for 1 to 2 minutes, 5 times a day for 3 weeks. And then that should resolve most of my symptoms. I laughed when he told me this because I thought he was an expert. I put up with what I thought was lunacy and started the breathing exercises. After 3 weeks, just like the doctor said, my skin and sleep began normalizing. I stopped taking the sleeping aids I had been using soon afterwards, but it was going to take another few months, statistically speaking, for me to return to baseline in my mental health. That should be a couple of months from now. You might be wondering, why would Jesus allow Satan to treat me this way? And what did Jesus mean by trust me, if that was Jesus at all? I wondered that myself. It says in Romans that we know that God causes all things to work together for good, for those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. During my counseling sessions with this doctor, I also discovered that people with complex PTSD also can have intrusive thoughts. And this got me very curious about if the intrusive thinking that I have been battling, I think, my whole life, was in some way related to my complex PTSD and the abusive way I was raised as a child. Well, the short answer is yes. Now, as I listened to the intrusive thoughts that would come to me, I wanted to learn more about them, the goals of these thoughts. I stopped feeling threatened by them and just felt very curious. And there was something I noticed. It was that almost all the intrusive thoughts I had could be placed into 3 different categories. They were seeking either validation, respect, or understanding. And they were seeking these 3 things in very toxic ways, hence intrusive thinking. I instinctively thought, and later corroborated with this psychologist, were these 3 topics, validation, respect, and understanding, were these 3 things the things my parents did not give me as a child? And my psychologist said yes. As I reflect back as a child, I don't even have a memory of ever feeling validation, respect, and understanding from my parents. As a result of not receiving these things from my parents, I seek to get these needs met that I did not get met in ways that can be pretty destructive. Or said another way, these old wounds, these very old wounds of respect, validation, and understanding that I did not receive were wounds Satan used to try to destroy my mind. Well, that was the end of my intrusive thinking, or so I thought. A month or so later, it came back during a stressful situation. And I was a bit more troubled this time about it, because I thought that this was the whole reason for the traumatic insomnia, which really tested my character. I am sometimes exhausted at the end of a day, especially a long day, because I am fighting these intrusive thoughts. It took up a lot of time. Time I could be planning videos or studying God's Word or enjoying time with friends. So when the intrusive thinking seemed cured, I was overjoyed. But it was not cured. It only temporarily disappeared. So I asked the Lord, after I explained all this to Him, what was going on, and why was I being afflicted with this again, thinking that I had already been healed. My question was, Lord, how is this going to go away for good? And He said, love. Sounds simple. The validation, respect, and understanding that I did not receive as a child is a form of love that I was denied. Can you imagine being a parent that did not give these basic needs to their child? I'm glad you can't if you can't, but if you can, please smarten up, or your child will have to struggle through life like me. It's been interesting. It's interesting that the love that I did not receive was the one thing that would heal this affliction. The love I did not get is all I had to give in return. And not giving love first and foremost is a sin. Now when I am attacked by these three topics, intrusively, respect, validation, and understanding, all I do is try to figure out a way how to love these people. And it always works. It now just serves as a reminder. Again, Satan used old wounds that were created in me probably before the age of 3, before I even knew how to speak. And Jesus, seeing I wanted to devote more time, more quality time to Him, the study of His Word, and loving His people, seeing how hard I kept on fighting with faith, took me out of a lack of knowledge about how I was raised as a child, and gave me the solution to the problem, which is in complete line with His great character. In ancient times, as shepherds walked through the wilderness, their sheep would basically follow them in a line. But at night, as it got dark, the shepherd would move into the middle of his herd so his sheep could hear his voice. Because when sheep get scared, they do some very stupid things. As the darkness of insomnia fell onto my life for those few months, I knew I had to get close to my shepherd and listen for his voice. Also, shepherds would often travel together, so their flocks would get mixed up. So when this would happen, each shepherd would sing his own special song, and every sheep knew the song of their shepherd and would fall out of the herd to follow behind their own shepherd. I was not walking in love, but my shepherd called me out of the herd, and I thank Him for that. Also, for all of you who are struggling with intrusive thoughts, try to love these people and see if that works.